The Pine Creek River raged on, swollen from days of relentless rain in the quiet town of Stillwater. The overcast sky and the constant roar of water crashing against rocks created an ominous atmosphere. Jake, a 12-year-old boy, didn't think twice before jumping in, unaware of the danger lurking beneath the surface. When he tried to swim back to the shore, his foot slipped on a slick rock, and the powerful current pulled him away. Desperately, he cried out for help, but his voice was drowned out by the thunderous rush of the river. Thunder, the black horse from Riverbend Ranch, was grazing a couple hundred yards away when he sensed something was wrong. A muffled cry reached his ears. The horse's instincts kicked in. Someone was in danger. With a sudden jolt, he raised his head, nostrils flaring, and without hesitation, galloped toward the sound. His heavy hooves crushed twigs and leaves along the forest path until he caught sight of the boy struggling against the raging water. Jake flailed wildly, trying to grab onto anything that might keep him afloat. The freezing water pulled at his body with terrifying force. His arms began to weaken, and exhaustion crept into his muscles. For a brief moment, he feared this was the end. But just as his hope began to fade, a shadow appeared in the distance. Thunder broke through the trees and charged into the river with unwavering determination. His eyes locked on Jake. The scene felt almost surreal. Jake, mustering every ounce of strength he had left, reached out toward the horse. Thunder pressed forward, unfazed by the powerful current. As the water surged around them, Jake managed to grab hold of the reins dangling from Thunder's bridle. His fingers clenched tightly, refusing to let go. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Thunder knew exactly what needed to be done. With immense strength, Thunder began to step backward, his hooves digging into the riverbed as the current fought to push him off balance. The icy water surged against his powerful frame, but he held firm. Jake clung desperately to the reins, his teeth chattering as he braced against the force of the river. It was a battle between life and death, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, Thunder reached a shallow area where the current was weaker. Jake's feet scraped the rocky riverbed beneath him. With a final burst of effort, he managed to lift his face above the surface, gasping for air. His ragged breaths mixed with the roaring sound of the river. He knew he was safe, for now. But the danger wasn't entirely over. Both he and Thunder still had obstacles to overcome before reaching true safety. Jake clung to Thunder's reins, coughing and gasping for air as cold water dripped from his face. His entire body shook from exhaustion and the numbing chill that seeped into his bones. The horse stood firm in the shallow part of the river, his powerful muscles tense as if sensing that the danger had not yet passed. Jake tried to speak, but only a raspy whisper came out. "Come on, Thunder. Get us out of here," he muttered weakly, his breath visible in the frigid air. The river's current was still strong, tugging insistently at Thunder's legs. Each step the horse took was a struggle, his hooves slipping on the slick rocks beneath the surface. Jake tightened his grip on the reins, fear creeping back into his mind. What if Thunder couldn't hold his footing? What if they were swept away again? He shook his head, forcing the terrifying thoughts aside. Thunder had saved him once. He had to trust the horse now. Slowly but surely, Thunder pressed forward, muscles rippling as he fought against the current. As they moved closer to the riverbank, Jake's mind raced with memories of how he'd ended up in this mess. Earlier that day, he'd wanted to explore the woods near the river, despite the warnings from his grandfather. "Stay away from the water, Jake," the old man had said sternly that morning. But Jake was stubborn, always seeking adventure. He hadn't expected a simple walk to turn into a life-threatening ordeal. Now, with every painful step Thunder took, Jake regretted not listening. The riverbank was just a few feet away when Thunder suddenly stumbled. Jake's heart jumped in his chest as the horse's front legs slipped on a hidden boulder. Thunder let out a sharp, startled snort, momentarily losing his balance. The current surged around them, as if trying to capitalize on their moment of vulnerability. "No, "Come on, Thunder!" Jake shouted, fear giving him a burst of energy. He clung tighter to the reins, his knuckles turning white. Thunder recovered quickly, digging his hind legs into the rocky ground beneath the water. With a determined grunt, he pushed forward, finding steady footing once more. Jake felt a surge of relief as the horse regained control. Slowly but steadily, they made it to the edge of the river. When Thunder's hooves finally touched solid ground, Jake almost collapsed from the overwhelming combination of fear and gratitude. He slid off Thunder's side, falling to his knees on the muddy shore. Jake sat there, breathing heavily as he looked up at Thunder. The horse stood tall and calm now, his ears flicking back and forth as he scanned the area for any further danger. Jake reached out, gently patting Thunder's wet neck. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. In that moment, Jake knew this was more than just a rescue. Something had shifted inside him. He had found a bond with the horse that went far deeper than he could have imagined. However, their journey was not over yet. Jake still had to find a way back home, and explain how he had almost lost his life. Jake wiped his face with the sleeve of his soaked shirt, shivering violently as the chill in the air seemed to bite into his skin. He couldn't stay here for long. The river might still rise, and night was approaching fast. The distant sky had taken on a grayish-purple hue, signaling that darkness would soon descend over the forest. He turned to Thunder, who stood calmly beside him, his dark coat shining with water. "We need to get moving," Jake said softly, his teeth chattering. Thunder snorted in response, almost as if he understood. Jake grabbed a handful of the horse's mane and pulled himself upright, his legs shaky beneath him. He glanced around the dense forest that bordered the river. He had wandered so far from the familiar trails that now everything looked foreign. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their towering forms blending into one another. Jake had no idea how to find the way back. His sense of adventure from earlier that day had been replaced by a growing sense of dread. As they moved away from the riverbank, Jake stumbled through the underbrush, with Thunder walking protectively at his side. Each step was a challenge. His clothes clung to his body, heavy with water, and the cold sapped his strength. He felt lightheaded and weak, his stomach twisting with hunger. He hadn't eaten since early that morning. For a moment, he considered stopping to rest, but the thought of being stranded in the dark forest kept him pushing forward. "Grandpa's gotta be worried sick by now," Jake mumbled to himself, imagining the old man pacing back and forth on the front porch of the ranch. His grandfather, a stern but caring figure, had always warned him about the dangers of the wilderness. Jake's reckless decision to explore near the river was probably his worst mistake yet. He imagined the lecture he'd get when he returned home, if he returned home. The thought sent a wave of anxiety through him, but he shook it off. Right now, survival was all that mattered. The forest began to grow eerily silent as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Even the birds had stopped their evening calls. Jake glanced nervously over his shoulder. The stillness unsettled him, as if the woods were holding their breath. He clutched Thunder's reins a little tighter, grateful for the horse's steady presence. "You're not scared, huh?" he asked aloud, trying to calm his own nerves. Thunder didn't react, his focus fixed on the path ahead, but his calm demeanor gave Jake a small sense of reassurance. Suddenly, a rustling noise broke the silence. Jake froze, his heart racing as he strained to hear. The sound came from somewhere to their left, hidden in the shadows of the trees. He glanced at Thunder, who had stopped as well, his ears perked in alertness. "What was that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. They stood there for a tense moment, waiting. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started. Jake swallowed hard, his instincts telling him that they weren't alone in the woods. The question now was, what or who was out there? Jake's pulse quickened as he scanned the trees around him, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The rustling noise had stopped, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The forest suddenly felt like a different place, ominous and alive with unseen eyes watching their every move. Jake tightened his grip on Thunder's reins and took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't afford to panic. Probably just an animal, he whispered to himself, though his voice betrayed his fear. Thunder remained still, his ears swiveling as if trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Jake noticed the horse's muscles tensing slightly. Thunder didn't seem afraid, but he was definitely on alert. Jake took a cautious step forward, his shoes squelching in the damp earth. "Come on, boy," he said softly, trying to sound confident. They needed to keep moving. The longer they stood there, the more vulnerable they became to whatever might be lurking in the woods. The sound came again, closer this time. Jake froze once more, his breath catching in his throat. It was a low, steady rustling, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. He felt a surge of panic but forced himself to remain still. Thunder gave a low snort, shaking his head, but didn't move from Jake's side. Okay, Jake muttered under his breath. He strained his ears, hoping to identify the sound. It wasn't the random movement of wind or a small animal. It was deliberate. Something was definitely out there. Seconds passed like hours. Then, from between the trees, a shadow emerged. At first, Jake couldn't make out what it was. His mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? But as the figure stepped into a patch of fading sunlight, Jake's fear was momentarily replaced by confusion. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a person. The figure appeared to be a man, wearing a tattered brown jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was partially obscured by the shadows and the growing twilight. He stood silently, watching them from a distance. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The man didn't say a word or make any threatening gestures, but his sudden presence in the middle of the forest was unsettling. Jake instinctively stepped back, his hand tightening around Thunder's reins. "Who are you?" Jake called out, his voice cracking slightly. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly raised a hand, signaling for calm. "You're a long way from the trail, son," the man finally said, his voice deep and rough like someone who hadn't spoken much in a long time. He took a few cautious steps forward but kept his distance. "You shouldn't be out here. These woods can be dangerous, especially near the river." Jake's mind raced with questions, but one thought overpowered them all. Was this man here to help, or did he have other intentions? Jake took a cautious step back, his eyes locked on the man standing in front of him. Every instinct told him to stay on guard. The stranger's presence in the middle of the forest, especially at this hour, didn't sit right with him. Thunder shifted slightly, snorting softly as if sensing Jake's unease. "What do you mean, dangerous?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His fingers twitched nervously at the reins. The man didn't move closer but kept his eyes on Jake. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "This area's no place for a kid. People have been swept away in that river. Others got lost out here and were never found." His words hung heavy in the air, sending a shiver down Jake's spine. The man crossed his arms and glanced toward the riverbank in the distance. "The woods can play tricks on you. Paths change, sounds echo. You'll wander in circles if you're not careful." Jake swallowed hard, trying to process the man's words. He didn't know whether to believe him or not. I didn't mean to come this far. I just got caught in the current," Jake explained, his voice low. He wondered if the man might have been one of those eccentric people who lived deep in the wilderness. His grandfather had mentioned stories about reclusive hunters or wanderers who stayed far from civilization. But those were just stories, right? The man gave a small, knowing nod. "You're lucky you've got that horse," he said, his voice softening slightly. He tilted his head toward Thunder. "He's the reason you're still breathing." Jake glanced at Thunder and felt a deep pang of gratitude. It was true. If not for Thunder's bravery, he'd have been pulled under the river and lost forever. Jake gently patted the horse's neck. "Yeah, he saved me," Jake whispered. "Where are you trying to get to?" the man asked, his tone a bit more practical now. Jake hesitated, unsure how much he should say. "Home," he finally replied. "My grandfather's ranch is near Riverbend." The man's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Riverbend. For a brief moment, Jake thought he saw a flicker of recognition in the stranger's eyes, but it quickly disappeared. "Riverbend," the man repeated, as if tasting the word. "You're still a good ways off from there. You won't make it before nightfall." Jake's stomach twisted at the thought of being stuck in the woods overnight. He didn't like the idea of trusting a stranger, but he also didn't have many options. The forest grew darker with each passing minute, and he didn't know the way back. The man seemed to sense Jake's hesitation. "There's an old path not far from here," he said. "It'll take you closer to the main road. But you'll need to move fast." He paused, his expression darkening. "And stay on the path. No matter what you hear or see." Jake's eyes widened at the ominous warning. Just what dangers was the man talking about? Jake's skin prickled at the man's warning. "Stay on the path. No matter what you hear or see." The words echoed in his mind like a cold wind cutting through the trees. He wanted to ask more, but the man turned and gestured toward a dense cluster of pines. "The trail starts just beyond there," he said. "It's easy to miss if you don't know where to look." Jake hesitated, still unsure if he could trust this stranger, but what choice did he have? Staying in the woods overnight was not an option. Thunder gave a soft snort, nudging Jake's shoulder as if urging him forward. Jake took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, thanks," he said quietly, keeping his eyes on the man. The stranger didn't respond right away. Instead, he gave one last glance at the darkening sky and then back at Jake. "Be careful out there," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he had appeared. Jake stood still for a moment, listening to the forest around him. The eerie silence returned. With a quick pat on Thunder's neck, Jake urged the horse to follow him toward the trail. The trees grew denser as they moved forward, and Jake had to push aside branches and step over twisted roots. Finally, he spotted what looked like an overgrown path weaving its way through the forest. It was narrow, barely more than a game trail, but it was there. He exhaled in relief. "This must be it," he muttered to himself. The shadows around them deepened, the fading light casting long, twisted shapes across the ground. Jake and Thunder walked cautiously down the path, their footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of fallen leaves. The forest felt strangely oppressive, as though it were closing in on them. Every now and then, Jake thought he heard faint whispers, like voices carried on the wind. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. "It's just your imagination," he told himself. Yet the man's warning echoed louder in his mind. "Stay on the path." As they continued, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Jake glanced over his shoulder more than once, but saw nothing except shadows. Thunder, however, seemed increasingly uneasy. His ears flicked back and forth, and he occasionally stopped, lifting his head high as if catching a scent in the air. "What is it, boy?" Jake whispered nervously, stroking Thunder's neck. The horse didn't respond, but his tension was clear. Jake's pulse quickened. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, a low, mournful sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't a howl or a cry, more like a long, drawn-out moan. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his ears. Thunder stomped a hoof, snorting anxiously. The sound came again, closer this time, sending chills down Jake's spine. He gripped the reins tighter and took a shaky step forward. "We're not stopping," he whispered, his voice barely audible. His mind raced with fear, But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was making that sound, they needed to get away from it, and fast. Jake's breaths came in short, shallow bursts as he pushed forward, his senses on high alert. The eerie moaning sound echoed again, sending a shiver down his spine. It seemed to move through the trees like a ghostly presence, surrounding him and thunder. The forest had grown unervingly quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just that haunting sound. "Keep going," Jake whispered to himself, forcing his feet to move. He couldn't let fear paralyze him now. Thunder was growing increasingly agitated. The horse tossed his head and shifted nervously, his muscles twitching under Jake's hand. He suddenly stopped and stared into the shadows to their left, ears pinned back. Jake followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness, but he saw nothing. There's nothing there," Jake said aloud, though he didn't believe his own words. He tightened his grip on the reins and gave a gentle tug. "Come on, boy, stay with me." Reluctantly, Thunder obeyed, though his tension was palpable. The path twisted ahead, disappearing behind a wall of thick trees. As Jake rounded the bend, he thought he saw something, a flash of movement, quick and silent. He froze mid-step, his eyes widening. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, blending into the darkness like a shadow. His heart pounded in his chest. "Okay, just keep calm," he whispered, trying to steady his shaking hands. His grandfather had always warned him that fear could make you see things that weren't really there. But this felt different. Something was out here with them. The strange moaning echoed again, much closer now. Jake's entire body tensed as Thunder let out a loud, anxious snort. Without warning, the horse reared slightly, yanking the reins from Jake's hand. "Thunder!" Jake shouted, stumbling backward as the horse pawed at the ground. He quickly grabbed the reins again, his fingers trembling. Thunder's eyes were wide with fear, his nostrils flaring as he took deep, rapid breaths. It was clear he wanted to bolt, and Jake had to fight to keep him under control. "Easy, easy, boy," he whispered, trying to calm both the horse and himself. The oppressive silence returned once more, broken only by the distant rustling of branches. Jake's mind raced. Should he turn back or keep moving forward? His instincts screamed for him to run, but he knew that leaving the path would be even more dangerous. The man's warning echoed in his mind like a command. Stay on the path, no matter what. Swallowing his fear, Jake gave Thunder's neck a reassuring pat. "We just have to keep going. We'll get out of here soon," he whispered. But deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. Something was hunting them. He could feel it. Jake and Thunder moved cautiously down the winding path, every step feeling heavier than the last. The forest around them seemed to close in tighter, the trees forming twisted, skeletal shapes in the dim light. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound, the mournful, chilling moan, wasn't gone. It lingered in the air like a whisper in the back of his mind. Each time it echoed, Jake felt the weight of unseen eyes watching his every move. Thunder suddenly stopped, ears perked and body rigid as a statue. Jake tensed, his breath catching. The horse's nostrils flared as he sniffed the air, then let out a nervous grunt. "What is it?" Jake whispered, his voice barely above a breath. He strained to hear, but at first there was only silence. Then, from somewhere ahead of them, he heard it, twigs snapping underfoot. Slowly, methodically. It wasn't just the wind or an animal moving aimlessly. Someone, or something, was walking toward them. A surge of panic shot through Jake's body. He grabbed Thunder's reins tighter and took a few shaky steps back. His mind screamed for him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead. The path twisted sharply up ahead, and whatever was making the noise was hidden around that corner. Jake's instincts warred with logic. He couldn't leave the path, but staying meant facing whatever was out there. "Thunder, we have to move," Jake whispered urgently. He tugged the reins gently, coaxing the horse forward. Thunder resisted at first, his hooves stamping nervously on the ground. "Come on," Jake pleaded, fear making his voice crack. Reluctantly, the horse obeyed, stepping forward with cautious, deliberate movements. They approached the curve in the path, every nerve in Jake's body on edge. He tried to listen for the footsteps again, but all he could hear was the blood pounding in his ears. As they rounded the corner, Jake stopped abruptly. The path ahead was empty, though shadows danced ominously across the forest floor. The air felt thick, suffocating, and a cold breeze rustled the trees overhead. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. Was it just in my head?
He wondered, but Thunder's tense body told him otherwise. Jake hesitated for a moment, then pressed forward. "We can't stop now," he whispered. Yet with each step, the overwhelming sense of dread grew stronger. He knew that whatever was out there wasn't far, and it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The oppressive silence of the forest was broken by a sharp crack behind them. Jake whirled around, his pulse spiking as his eyes darted through the trees. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound brave. There was no response, only the rustling of leaves swaying in the cold wind. Jake's mind raced, filled with images of every possible threat lurking in the shadows. He wasn't imagining things. Something was following them. Thunder let out a low, warning snort, his body tense and alert. The horse's ears flicked toward the source of the sound as he backed up slightly, forcing Jake to stumble to keep his balance. "Easy, boy. We've got this," Jake whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. A chill ran down his spine as he caught sight of movement again. A figure slipping between the trees, too fast and fleeting for him to get a clear look. Jake clenched his jaw and turned back to the path. He couldn't afford to stand still. They continued forward, each step feeling like a countdown to an inevitable encounter. The moaning sound returned, louder now, closer. It didn't sound human. There was something primal about it, almost like the forest itself was groaning in pain. Jake's throat tightened as his fear escalated. He glanced at Thunder, whose eyes were wide with panic. "We have to get out of here," Jake muttered urgently. He gripped the reins tighter and picked up his pace, ignoring the ache in his legs and the biting cold. Without warning, a figure appeared directly on the path ahead. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. It was the man from before, but something was different. His face was obscured by the deepening shadows, his posture rigid and unnatural. "I told you to stay on the path," the man said, his voice hollow and distant, as though coming from somewhere far away. Jake felt a wave of dread wash over him. "I am on the path," Jake shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. But the man didn't move. He simply stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Jake's heart raced as he looked around frantically. Thunder stomped nervously, refusing to go any closer to the figure. The eerie stillness of the man sent chills through Jake's entire body. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, the shadows around him seemed to shift and writhe, making his outline blur and distort. Thunder reared slightly, letting out a frightened whinny. Jake struggled to calm the horse. "We're leaving," he cried, pulling Thunder back. The only way forward was past the man. But Jake knew deep down that crossing paths with him might unleash something far worse. He turned sharply, pulling Thunder off the path, risking everything by stepping into the unknown wilderness. Jake stumbled through the dense forest, branches slashing at his arms and face as he led Thunder off the path. His mind screamed at him for abandoning the only safety the man had warned him about, but fear had taken control. Behind him, the eerie moaning sound intensified, weaving through the trees like a chilling chant. He didn't dare look back. "Keep going, Thunder," he whispered, his voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion. The horse, though trembling with unease, followed Jake's lead, their survival instincts pushing them forward. For what felt like an eternity, they navigated the twisted maze of trees. Jake's legs burned with each step, but he refused to stop. The oppressive atmosphere of the forest seemed to press down harder the farther they moved. The shadows writhed around them, and Jake thought he heard faint whispers, soft, unintelligible voices drifting in the wind. He shook his head, trying to clear the fear-induced hallucinations. "It's not real. It's not real," he muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. Suddenly, the forest began to change. The dense trees thinned out, and moonlight pierced through the canopy above, illuminating a clearing up ahead. Jake felt a surge of hope. Maybe they were close to safety. He stumbled into the open space and collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. Thunder stood beside him, his nostrils flaring as he scanned the area cautiously. The moaning and whispers faded into silence, leaving only the gentle rustle of leaves. The forest's grip seemed to loosen at last. Jake leaned against Thunder, his heartbeat finally slowing. "We made it," he whispered, almost in disbelief. He looked around the clearing, his senses slowly returning to normal. It felt different here, calm and peaceful, as though they had crossed some invisible barrier. His fear began to melt away, replaced by overwhelming exhaustion. Jake knew they couldn't rest for long, but for the first time in hours, he felt like they were out of immediate danger. As he caught his breath, a distant sound reached his ears, faint but familiar. He strained to listen. It was the gentle clinking of metal and the low rumble of wheels on gravel. A road. Jake's eyes widened in relief. They were close to the main trail leading back to the ranch. He climbed to his feet and gave Thunder a grateful pat. "Come on, buddy. We're almost home," he said, his voice filled with renewed determination. Together, they walked toward the sound, leaving the haunted forest behind. Jake didn't know what they had encountered or why the man had appeared to warn him, but one thing was certain: he would never forget this night. The woods had tested him, but he had survived. As they neared the road, Jake thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned but saw only shadows dancing among the trees. A shiver ran down his spine. "Stay on the path," the man's warning echoed once more in his mind. Jake silently promised himself that he would never stray again. He and Thunder pressed on, determined to leave the darkness behind for good.